The midday sun cast a warm glow through the windows of the small diner. The clink of silverware and low chatter filled the air as the lunchtime rush began. It was just another typical day at the diner, a place where regulars came for their daily coffee and comfort food. But today something was about to change. A man walked in, his appearance instantly standing out among the bustling crowd. He was dressed in a worn-out military jacket, his unkempt beard and tired eyes betraying the hardships he'd endured. His shoes were scuffed, and his hands trembled slightly as he made his way to the counter. He seemed lost, almost like he didn't belong here. Sarah, the young waitress, glanced up from the order she was taking. Her eyes narrowed when she saw him. She didn't recognize him as one of the regulars, and the diner had a strict policy. No one from off the street got free meals, especially not someone who looked like he hadn't bathed in days. The man's eyes met hers and he gave a small, tentative smile. "Could I get a cup of coffee?" Sarah hesitated. She could feel the weight of the other customer's eyes on her, the tension building. She had seen people like him before, people who would sit at the counter all day ordering nothing but a glass of water, draining the energy of the room. "Sorry," she said, her voice a little sharper than she intended. "We don't serve the homeless here." The words felt heavy as they left her lips and the man's face fell. He looked stunned, as if he hadn't expected the rejection. He stood there, frozen for a moment, before his shoulders slumped in resignation. "Please, just a cup of coffee," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Sarah's heart tugged, but she stood firm. She didn't want to lose her job, and there were rules to follow. But as the man turned to leave, something shifted. The whole diner seemed to hold its breath, and then, as if by some twist of fate, the door swung open again. A figure entered. Tall, unmistakable. It was Keanu Reeves. Sarah blinked, not sure if she was seeing things. Keanu Reeves, the Hollywood star, the one person who had been a constant in everyone's lives, on the big screen, on social media, always the embodiment of kindness and humility. He smiled, walking toward the man with the same easygoing demeanor he portrayed in his films. "Hey, buddy," Keanu said with a warm smile, offering his hand to the man. "I think you deserve a cup of coffee, don't you?" The whole diner fell silent. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This was insane. Keanu Reeves, of all people, was stepping in to help. As she stood there, frozen, the man hesitated, then slowly reached for Keanu's hand. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on Sarah. What had just happened? And why was Keanu here, in her diner, at this exact moment? To find out what happens next, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We've got more twists coming your way in this unforgettable story. Sarah wiped down the counter, her hands moving mechanically as she tried to steady the thoughts rushing through her mind. She had always prided herself on being practical, focused, and driven, but this moment, this unexpected encounter with Keanu Reeves, was shaking her in ways she couldn't explain. She wasn't used to being thrown off like this. Sarah had worked at the diner for nearly 2 years now, ever since she moved to this small town from a big city, hoping to escape the mess of her past. Back in her old life, she'd been someone else, someone who had dreams of becoming a successful graphic designer, maybe even owning her own studio someday. But life had a way of throwing curveballs. After a messy breakup and a few bad decisions, she found herself running from one thing after another, with no real direction. The diner had seemed like a safe bet at first. It was a small town job, simple and stable. At least, that's what she told herself. But there were days, more often than not, when she felt like something was missing, like she was just going through the motions. She spent her days serving coffee to customers who barely noticed her, and the nights at home, staring at a blank screen, wishing she could be doing something else. She hadn't realized how empty she felt until today, when her world collided with the man in the worn military jacket. His quiet plea for just a cup of coffee had shaken something deep inside her. She hadn't known his story, but there was a certain sadness in his eyes that spoke volumes. She felt it too, that sense of loss, that feeling of being stuck, just like him. But Sarah wasn't the type to let those emotions take over. She pushed them down, focusing instead on the practical things: keeping her job, paying her rent, surviving. That's how she got by. Joe, the man in the military jacket, was another story. His past was written all over his face, the lines of age mixed with the remnants of a once youthful determination. His eyes, though tired, held a glimmer of something more, a life lived, a life lost. He had the look of someone who had seen too much, fought too hard, and was now left alone, forgotten by society. Sarah had caught a glimpse of that pain as she turned him away. It wasn't just about the coffee. It was about the rejection, the silent judgment of a person who had nowhere to go and nothing to lose. It made Sarah feel small. She wasn't proud of what she had said, but she didn't know how to take it back. And then, just when she thought she had lost all sense of control, Keanu Reeves appeared. Keanu, with his unassuming presence, had stepped in as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The actor, the hero, the person everyone looked up to. He wasn't just here to act in movies, he was here to be kind, to make a difference, even in the smallest of moments. But Sarah wasn't sure why he was here. Why had he come to her diner? What had drawn him to that moment, to that man, to her? Maybe, just maybe, it was more than just coincidence. Maybe Keanu Reeves was here to show her something she had been missing all along. The ability to see people, not just as they appeared, but for who they truly were. And maybe, just maybe, that man in the jacket wasn't just a homeless veteran. Maybe he was a reminder that no one was ever really as invisible as they seemed. As Sarah tried to make sense of everything, she glanced up and saw Keanu talking to Joe by the counter. The conversation was quiet, but the way Joe's posture shifted, it was as if Keanu had offered him something more than just a cup of coffee. He had offered him respect, dignity. Something inside Sarah stirred. She knew she couldn't go back and change her words, but she could change the way she saw the world from here on out. The door swung open again, and the diner's usual customers returned to their meals, chatting away. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was a moment she'd remember forever. She wasn't just serving food anymore. She was witnessing something profound, something that might just change the course of her life. Little did she know, the man who had stepped in, with kindness, wasn't just a famous actor. He was about to change her life, and Joe's as well. The moments after Keanu's entrance felt surreal. The quiet chatter of the diner had returned, but Sarah couldn't quite shake the intensity of what had just happened. She stood frozen, behind the counter, watching as Keanu and Joe sat at a corner booth, their heads bent in deep conversation. The buzz of the restaurant felt distant, muffled, like she was suddenly an outsider in her own world. She had done it again, turned someone away when they needed kindness most. And yet Keanu had turned this entire situation on its head. Joe had gone from feeling rejected and alone to being treated with dignity, simply because of one person's intervention. The contrast hit Sarah harder than she expected. The worst part? She was still angry at herself. She'd built walls around herself for so long, pretending everything was okay. But when she looked at Joe, she saw something deeper, a reminder of how easy it was to fall through the cracks. She didn't even know his story, but she already felt guilty. That guilt gnawed at her, making her question everything about her decisions. Just as Sarah began to contemplate what had just unfolded, the sound of a new customer entering the diner snapped her back into reality. She glanced up to see a well-dressed businessman making his way to the counter. He flashed a tight smile at her before ordering his usual. Sarah nodded, taking the order as the weight of her thoughts continued to cloud her mind. It wasn't long before the businessman leaned in, lowering his voice. "You know, Sarah, I can't believe you let that guy stay. Looks like he's just going to take up space. We're all here for a quick meal and now we have this distraction." His words were dismissive, and he didn't even attempt to hide the disgust in his tone. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She wanted to argue with him, tell him he didn't know a thing about Joe or the struggles some people faced. But she bit her tongue, knowing that would only make things worse. She had heard the murmurs from the other tables, whispers of discomfort and judgment. The man in the corner booth, Joe, wasn't just an outsider anymore. He was becoming a problem. "People like that don't belong here," the businessman continued, lowering his voice even more as if trying to make sure no one else could hear. "I mean, what's next? Are we going to start serving everyone who walks in off the street? This place isn't a charity." Sarah felt her chest tighten. The words stung more than she wanted to admit. She knew it wasn't right to judge someone based on their appearance, but her mind kept circling back to the same fear. What if Keanu's kindness was misplaced? What if this was going to backfire? Just then she noticed Keanu talking with Joe, his face calm but his expression intent. Joe was talking, but Sarah couldn't hear the words. She was too busy trying to keep her composure. Keanu's quiet smile and his mannerisms seemed to disarm everyone, but Sarah couldn't help but feel the pressure building in her chest. The tension in the room was palpable. "Is everything okay, Sarah?" A voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to see the diner's owner, Clara, standing beside her. Clara had been in the business long enough to know when something was off, and right now, Sarah was not herself. Yeah, everything's fine," Sarah stammered, trying to sound casual as she wiped the counter once more. But she could feel Clara's eyes on her, sensing the turmoil beneath her calm exterior. Clara leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "You've got to watch yourself. Customers are already talking. It's not easy, I know, but we can't let things get out of hand." The words hit Sarah like a slap in the face. She knew Clara was just looking out for her, but it only reminded her of what she had done, how easy it was to feel the weight of responsibility when you made a mistake. Clara was right. Sarah had to be careful. If the diner started losing business, because of Joe, things could spiral out of control fast. And yet there was Keanu, calm, unaffected, and completely wrapped up in his conversation with Joe, giving him attention like he was any other customer. It was almost as if he didn't even see the judgment that was starting to creep in from the rest of the diner. Sarah stepped back and took a deep breath. The pressure was mounting, but she wasn't about to let her fear decide her actions. Not this time. She had to make a choice. She could follow the crowd and push Joe out, just like she had done before. Or she could stand by him, learn from Keanu's quiet strength, and try to make things right. But as she glanced back at Joe, she saw his weary eyes glancing toward the exit, as if he was ready to leave. Was he giving up on this place? Was he about to disappear back into the world he came from, unnoticed and forgotten? Keanu's voice cut through her thoughts. "Joe," he said with a smile, "how about we get you a hot meal? I'm not leaving until I see you have a full stomach." Something in Sarah stirred. Was this it? Could she actually do the right thing? Could she stand up and offer Joe what he deserved? A chance at dignity, not rejection. She didn't know what the future would hold, but at that moment, Sarah made a decision. She wasn't going to let Joe leave without doing something. Maybe it wouldn't solve everything, but it would be a start. The weight of her decision hung in the air as she walked toward Joe's booth, and as she moved, she knew that the story of this day was far from over. Sarah took a deep breath and walked toward the corner booth where Keanu and Joe sat. Every step felt heavier, the weight of her decision bearing down on her. She hadn't even realized how tense her shoulders had become until she forced herself to relax, trying to shake off the nervous energy swirling inside her. As she approached, Keanu looked up at her with a soft, understanding smile. His eyes, full of warmth, seemed to see through all of her hesitation, as if he already knew what she was thinking. "Hey, Sarah," Keanu said, his voice gentle but firm, like he was guiding her through a decision. "Come sit down for a second. Joe's been telling me a bit about his story." Sarah hesitated, standing by the booth, but then Joe's eyes met hers. There was something about his gaze that tugged at her heart, an unspoken understanding, a quiet plea for connection. He wasn't just some random homeless guy. He was a person with a past, with feelings, with dreams, someone who had experienced the ups and downs of life in a way she couldn't even begin to understand. Keanu patted the seat next to him. "Why don't you join us? We're just getting started, and maybe you can help me out here." Sarah hesitated, then sat down, the smell of fresh coffee and the hum of the diner's air conditioning creating a strange calm amidst the storm of her thoughts. Joe shifted in his seat, his hands wrapped tightly around a coffee cup that looked far too large for him. "I've been listening to Joe's story," Keanu said, his voice soft yet steady. He's a vet, Sarah. A man who gave a lot for his country, and now he's fighting a different kind of battle. Sarah glanced at Joe, who was staring at his coffee, his fingers trembling just slightly around the mug. She hadn't noticed before, but his hands were worn, calloused and scarred. It was a subtle reminder of the years of struggle he had endured. Her heart sank. The man she had judged earlier was far more than she had ever imagined. Keanu continued, his tone sincere. Joe's been on the streets for a while. He's had his fair share of bad luck, but what he really needs right now is a little bit of humanity, a little kindness. Sarah nodded slowly, her throat tight. She couldn't believe how wrong she had been, how quick she had been to dismiss him. She felt the weight of her actions pressing down on her chest. Keanu glanced at her and then back at Joe. "You know, Sarah," he said, as if they were talking about any ordinary customer, "sometimes a person just needs to be seen. Not for what they have or don't have, but for who they are." It hit her like a wave. All her life she had been taught to look at the surface, to judge quickly, to make snap decisions based on what seemed obvious. But now, sitting here, she realized how much she had missed. How often she had been blind to the complexities of the people around her, judging them by their appearances, by their struggles, instead of seeing them as people. Joe shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I don't expect anything from anyone," he said quietly, his voice gravelly from years of hardship. "But sometimes it's nice to feel like you matter. Just a little." The words hung in the air, and Sarah felt her heart breaking for this man who had given so much of himself, only to be forgotten by the world. But something in her stirred. She had the chance to do better. She had the chance to make this right. She turned to Keanu, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what to say. I shouldn't have turned him away." Keanu smiled kindly. "It's okay, we all make mistakes. What matters is what we do next." Sarah nodded, feeling the heavy burden of guilt lift just a little as she made a decision. She was going to do something for Joe, something that went beyond a cup of coffee or a free meal. It wasn't about charity. It was about respect, dignity, giving him what he deserved as a human being. She stood up, turning toward the kitchen. The thought of doing the right thing filled her with nervous energy, but she couldn't back down. Now, as she walked toward the kitchen, she saw Clara watching her, a curious look in her eyes. Before she could even make it through the kitchen door, Clara called out, "Sarah, wait!" Clara was standing by the back door, arms crossed, her brow furrowed with concern. "What's going on? Are you really going to give him what he's asking for? You know how this could affect business." Sarah felt the conflict within herself, the fear of losing her job, the hesitation to challenge the way things had always been done. But she took a deep breath. "Clara," Sarah said, her voice steady, "he's a human being, not a problem to fix, and I think he deserves more than just a quick rejection. We've been here all this time making decisions based on fear. I'm going to do what's right, for him and for me." Clara didn't speak right away, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of approval, maybe even relief. She stepped aside, letting Sarah pass. As Sarah returned to the dining area, she took a deep breath, walking up to Joe's booth. "Joe," she said, her voice strong but kind, "I'd like to offer you a hot meal. No strings attached. It's on me." Joe's eyes widened in surprise, and for a brief moment, his face softened. "You don't have to do that." "I want to," Sarah said. "Everyone deserves a chance to be treated with dignity." Keanu smiled from across the room, his quiet encouragement all she needed. The decision had been made. This moment, this small gesture of kindness, was the beginning of something bigger than all of them. And as Sarah walked back to the kitchen to put in Joe's order, she realized something crucial. The journey wasn't just about helping Joe. It was about her own transformation. Something had shifted within her. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was learning to truly see. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of the change that would sweep through the diner and through her life. The diner was quieter than usual. The hum of conversation was subdued, almost reverential, as if everyone had noticed the shift in the air. Sarah stood at the counter, trying to keep her hands from trembling as she watched Joe slowly begin to eat the meal she had promised him. He didn't look up at first, too focused on the food, but Sarah could see his hands, now steady, lifting the fork to his mouth. Keanu, sitting across from Joe, had a soft but unwavering smile on his face. It was as though he were not only giving Joe a meal, but offering him a sense of restoration, a reminder of his worth. It was the first time Sarah had ever seen someone give so selflessly. The idea of giving without expecting anything in return was foreign to her, but watching Keanu do it made her wonder why she hadn't thought about it before. The moment was not without its weight. There were people in the diner who had seen it all unfold, the rejection, the judgment, the surprise act of kindness, and now there was a stillness hanging in the air. Sarah could almost feel the tension shift. Some of the regulars glanced over at Joe, unsure of how to react to the change in dynamic. They'd never seen him get special treatment before, but then a few of them started to soften, their eyes no longer cold and dismissive. One of the older men who'd been quietly eating his lunch for the past half hour finally spoke up. "That's good food, Joe," he said, his voice low but kind. "You enjoying it?" Joe's eyes shot up in surprise. He hadn't expected anyone to acknowledge him, at least not like this. But there was something in the way the man spoke that made Joe's expression soften. "Yeah, it's really good," Joe answered, his voice gruff but grateful. The man nodded and smiled, going back to his meal. It wasn't much, but it was. Something that hadn't been there before. Sarah watched as the atmosphere in the diner subtly shifted. It was as if the people in the room were collectively letting go of the invisible barriers they had put up between themselves and Joe. It was as if, by Keanu's example, they were starting to see him, not as the homeless man who had stumbled in, but as a person. The air was heavy with unspoken thoughts when Sarah finally found the courage to sit down at the booth across from Joe and Keanu. Her heart was pounding, but her decision to sit there felt right. This wasn't just about the meal. It wasn't even just about Joe anymore. It was about breaking through the silence, about embracing the raw humanity of this moment. "Joe," Sarah said, her voice quieter than she intended. "I know I wasn't kind to you before. She stopped herself. She couldn't fully explain it, couldn't justify it. Her words felt inadequate, but she needed him to know she was sorry. Joe's eyes softened again, the walls around him starting to crack just a little. He put down his fork and looked at her directly. "It's all right," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I've been treated worse. You didn't know my story. Most people don't." Sarah took a deep breath, her own walls beginning to crumble. "I didn't know it, but I should have taken the time to see you. I'm sorry." Joe nodded, a flicker of something like understanding in his gaze. "You're not the first, and you won't be the last. But I appreciate you giving me a chance to eat, at least." Keanu leaned forward, his smile gentle but filled with purpose. "We all need someone to believe in us sometimes, Sarah, even when we've lost our way." His words landed deeply in her chest. It was as if he wasn't just talking about Joe anymore. He was talking about her, too, about the way she had been lost in her own life, stuck in routines that didn't bring her any joy or meaning. She had been drifting, making decisions based on fear, on survival. She had never truly stopped to question if she was living her life with purpose. The words hung in the air, unspoken but resonant. Sarah felt a shift in her, a sense of clarity rising up inside of her. She could feel the potential of change, not just in Joe's life but in her own. The emotions swirling inside her finally broke through the surface. She wasn't just apologizing to Joe. She was apologizing to herself for all the missed chances, all the moments where she had been blind to the truth about the people around her. As she looked across the booth, she saw not just Joe and Keanu, but a deeper understanding, one she hadn't had before. She wasn't just a waitress serving coffee and food. She was a person with the power to make a difference. She had choices. She could see people as they were, not as society had labeled them. And that realization, that moment of truth, left her feeling raw but alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. Joe pushed his plate aside and gave her a soft look. "You don't have to be sorry. I know what it's like to be invisible." Keanu's voice cut through, low and steady. None of us are invisible, Joe, not here, not anymore. A wave of emotion swept over Sarah. The warmth in the diner felt different now. The air seemed to hum with possibility. She looked down at her hands, and for the first time in a long time, they didn't feel like they were just doing a job. They felt like they could make a difference. And just then, the bell over the door rang as a new customer entered. The shift had already begun. This wasn't just about a hot meal or an unexpected kindness. This was about the power of human connection, the quiet strength that comes from treating others with dignity, respect, and kindness, no matter where they came from or what their past looked like. It wasn't just Joe who had been changed. It was Sarah, too. In that one moment, something in her life clicked into place. The world wasn't just a series of tasks and routines. It was full of people, each with their own stories, their own struggles, and their own need for understanding. And Sarah knew with every fiber of her being that she would never be the same again. The diner buzzed with the steady clinking of plates, the hum of the coffee machine, and the gentle murmur of conversations. But for Sarah, the world seemed quieter now, almost as though she had stepped into a new reality. She was no longer just going through the motions of serving food and coffee. Every interaction felt more meaningful. Every moment felt more alive. The tension that had clouded her thoughts since she'd first turned Joe away had lifted. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by the weight of her mistakes, Sarah felt a sense of peace, like the weight of the world had been lifted off her shoulders. Her eyes found Joe across the room, sitting at the corner booth with Keanu. Joe had finished his meal and was now sipping his coffee, his face relaxed, no longer carrying the hardened expression of a man who had seen too much of the harsh side of life. He was, for the first time in a long while, at peace. Keanu caught Sarah's eye from across the room, and she gave him a small smile. He didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to point out that she had done the right thing. The quiet approval in his eyes was enough. He knew, she knew, but there was still something left for Sarah to do, something she had to come to terms with within herself. As she wiped down the counter, Clara walked up beside her, her footsteps hesitant but purposeful. Clara had been quiet for the rest of the afternoon, watching everything unfold from the sidelines. She had been part of the old mindset, the one that said people like Joe were just problems to solve, not people to connect with. But Sarah knew somehow that Clara had seen something today that would change her too. "Sarah," Clara said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft but genuine. I was wrong, I've seen it now. How you treated Joe, how you gave him a chance when no one else would. It was right. It's hard to change the way we see people, you know? I've been thinking about how I've judged people in the past, and I'm not proud of it." Sarah looked at Clara, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. She had seen it too, the shift in Clara's demeanor, the way she was starting to open up to the idea that maybe things didn't have to be the way they always had been. "It's not easy," Sarah said, her voice gentle. "It's easier to judge, to assume people are beyond help, but everyone has a story. Everyone has something they're going through. I've learned that today. Joe didn't just need food. He needed someone to treat him like a person, not a problem." Clara nodded slowly, absorbing Sarah's words. "Yeah, and it's not just Joe. It's everyone. I've realized that I've been living in my own little bubble. I've been so focused on work, on keeping things running smoothly here, that I didn't stop to think about the people we serve. I think I've been treating them like they're just customers instead of people." "Exactly," Sarah said, her heart swelling with the understanding that was blossoming between them. "The thing is, when you start seeing people for who they really are, when you stop seeing them through a lens of judgment and assumptions, you start to see the world differently. You start to connect with people in ways you never thought possible." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the diner filled the silence between them, but it was a peaceful silence. Clara seemed deep in thought, and Sarah had the feeling that the conversation they were having wasn't just about Joe or about the diner. It was about life, about how they both had been living on autopilot for far too long. "I think," Clara began, her voice more confident now, "I want to start making changes. I want to treat people differently. I want to stop judging them based on the surface and start seeing them, really seeing them." Sarah smiled softly. "That's all any of us can do, Clara. We'll make mistakes along the way, but as long as we really try to do better, that's what matters. Clara smiled back, a hint of relief in her expression. Thanks, Sarah. You've really made me think. Sarah nodded, feeling a sense of contentment. The atmosphere in the diner felt different now, warmer somehow. The customers weren't just passing through anymore. They were people who could be seen and heard. And the waitress, who had once been caught in the web of judgment and routine, was now a part of something much bigger, something that connected people, heart to heart. She glanced over at Keanu and Joe once more. They were still deep in conversation, but the difference was clear. They were not alone anymore. The world hadn't changed completely, but Sarah had taken a step in the right direction. And so had Clara. The shift in their own hearts was a small but significant part of a bigger picture, a small part of humanity coming together, one small act of kindness at a time. As Sarah made her way to the back to grab another coffee pot, she couldn't help but reflect on how this day had changed her. There was no dramatic fanfare, no life-altering revelation, but the change in her was real. She had stepped out of her comfort zone, faced her own shortcomings, and made a difference in someone else's life. And in doing so, she had found a deeper sense of purpose within her own. As she poured coffee into the cups at the counter, she felt something else, a quiet sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't as broken as it seemed. Maybe it could be healed, one small gesture at a time. She looked at Joe and Keanu once more, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The lesson wasn't just for Joe, it was for her too. So what do you think? If you were in Sarah's shoes, would you have treated Joe differently from the beginning? Or have you had moments where you've learned to see people in a new light? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you want to continue following Sarah's journey of self-discovery and kindness. Let's keep this conversation going. The diner buzzed with the usual sounds of plates being cleared, the whir of the coffee machine and soft chatter between customers. But there was an unmistakable shift in the energy. Sarah's mind wandered as she wiped down the counter, reflecting on the whirlwind of events that had taken place over the last few hours. It felt like she had stepped into a completely new version of herself, one who could no longer remain blind to the humanity around her. The simple act of kindness that Keanu had shown Joe had ignited something inside her. And as she looked around the room, she realized that the chain reaction had already begun. Clara, who had been working alongside her all day, no longer had the same guarded expression she once wore. Her eyes had softened, and her movements, once mechanical, now held purpose. Clara had seen the transformation in Sarah, and it was clear she was beginning to understand what Sarah had known for some time. Kindness wasn't just a nice thing to do, it was the right thing to do. Sarah wasn't alone in this journey anymore. She could see the changes happening in the diner, and the customers who had witnessed the afternoon's events weren't unaffected either. Some of them still avoided eye contact with Joe, but more and more people were starting to recognize him as just another person, someone who was deserving of kindness, respect, and dignity. And Keanu? He had quietly slipped out after the meal was over, leaving a hefty tip for Sarah, a tip that would cover Joe's meal and then some. He hadn't asked for anything in return. He hadn't even expected any acknowledgement for what he had done. He had just acted out of pure, simple compassion. Sarah thought about the world outside the walls of this small diner, the way people often lived in their own bubbles, unaware or indifferent to the struggles of others, the way judgments were made without ever hearing the full story. But in this small moment, in this small corner of the world, she had witnessed the power of kindness, how it could break down walls, change perspectives, and spark something greater than herself. Taking a deep breath, Sarah glanced over at Joe one more time. He was sitting by the window, staring out into the busy street. His eyes looked peaceful now, not filled with the resignation that had once marked his every move. The other patrons who had been silently watching him all afternoon had gone back to their meals, but Sarah noticed that their gazes were no longer as harsh or dismissive. Maybe they were starting to understand too. It was a slow shift, one that wouldn't happen overnight, but it was a start. Sarah felt that if she kept showing up, if she kept trying, those small acts of kindness would ripple outward. People would start to see one another as humans, not as problems, and maybe, just maybe, the world would feel a little less cold. She walked over to the table where Joe had been sitting, now alone with his coffee cup. His meal was finished, but his gaze remained distant, like he was contemplating the world outside. Sarah hesitated for a moment before sitting across from him. "How's the coffee?" she asked, her voice soft but warm. Joe looked up, and for a second she thought he might retreat into his shell like he had before. But instead he gave her a small, tired smile. "It's good. Better than most places I've been to lately." Sarah returned his smile, feeling a sense of connection, however small. "I'm glad. I hope you'll come back sometime." Joe's eyes twinkled just a bit as he took another sip of his coffee. "Maybe I will. You've got a good place here, a good vibe, not like the others." She nodded, feeling the weight of those words sink in. She had never expected Joe to say anything like that. In the past, she would have assumed someone like him would never care about the atmosphere of the place. But maybe she had been wrong. Maybe everyone had something they valued, even if they didn't always show it. She smiled, a sense of warmth spreading through her chest. "Take care, Joe." "You too, Sarah," he replied, his voice soft but sincere. As she walked away, Sarah felt a mix of emotions: hope, gratitude, and something else, a sense of peace, knowing that she had played a small part in something bigger, in changing not just Joe's day, but in changing herself. She could feel that this moment would stay with her for a long time, that it would shape the way she interacted with the world from now on. The bell over the door jingled as another customer walked in, and Sarah turned to greet them, her smile a little brighter. She didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time she felt hopeful, hopeful for herself, for Joe, and for everyone who had been touched by the kindness of a stranger. Now that you've reached the end of this chapter, we want to hear from you. How do you think small acts of kindness can change the world around us? Have you ever had a moment where someone's kindness made a huge difference in your life? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Stay tuned for more heartwarming stories and life lessons that remind us of the power of compassion, one step at a time. Let's keep the conversation going, because, as Sarah learned, it only takes one small act to create a ripple effect. The days following the incident with Joe had felt different. Sarah could feel it in the way the customers greeted her with more warmth, the way they lingered a little longer at their tables, exchanging smiles and small talk. It wasn't just the regulars. New faces were coming in too, some of them even sitting down at Joe's usual booth, as if he had left behind an invisible mark on the place. The diner had become more than just a spot to grab a meal. It was now a place where people seemed to feel a little less alone. Sarah had started making a conscious effort to greet every person who walked through the door, not just with a friendly smile, but with genuine curiosity. She wanted to know their names, their stories. She had learned, through Joe's unexpected visit and Keanu's quiet encouragement, that there was a lot more to a person than what appeared on the surface. She wasn't going to let herself forget that again. It wasn't easy at first. The habits of her old self, the one who went through the motions of work without ever really seeing the people she served, still lingered. There were days when she found herself on autopilot, the weight of the world outside the diner creeping in, but those were becoming fewer and farther between. One afternoon, Sarah found herself at the counter, wiping down the sticky surface where a cup of coffee had been spilled. She glanced around the diner, her eyes settling on a mother with 2 children, the little boy clutching a crumpled napkin as he played with his fork. The girl was excitedly telling her mom about the game she'd played at school. Sarah smiled to herself as she listened, noticing the little moments of happiness that often went unnoticed in the rush of everyday life. It was then that Clara came over to her, holding a tray of dirty dishes. Clara had changed too. The shift in her was subtle but noticeable. She seemed more grounded, more present. Sarah could sense that Clara had been reflecting on her own actions, on her own approach to life and work. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other day," Clara said, her voice softer than usual. "You know, about people needing To be seen. I didn't really get it at first, but now I do. I've started to treat our customers differently, and it's weird, Sarah, but I feel like I'm connecting with them in a way I never did before. Sarah looked at Clara, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. I'm glad to hear that. It's not always easy, but every little bit helps, right? Just seeing someone for who they really are can make such a difference. Clara nodded, her eyes bright with understanding. It's kind of like a domino effect. You treat one person well and they'll pass it on. It makes you feel good, and then they feel good, and it just keeps going. Exactly, Sarah said, her mind drifting back to Joe. He hadn't come back to the diner since that day, but Sarah felt a deep sense of connection to him, even from afar. She hoped that wherever he was finding moments of peace. She hoped that somehow the kindness that had been extended to him had made a lasting impact. The bell over the door jingled, pulling Sarah back into the present. She turned and saw a familiar face. Joe. He had returned, but this time he wasn't alone. He had brought with him a small bag of groceries, a gift for the diner. "Hey, Sarah," he greeted, his voice low but steady. "I wanted to thank you again. For that meal, you didn't have to do that, but you did. And I guess I just wanted to give something back." Sarah's heart warmed as she saw the genuine gratitude in Joe's eyes. He didn't look like the man who had walked into the diner that day, hungry, broken, and resigned. He looked whole. He had found something, maybe not everything he had been looking for, but enough to make him feel human again, enough to give him the strength to walk back into the diner and offer something in return. "You didn't have to bring anything, Joe," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I'm glad you're here. You're always welcome here." Joe nodded, a slow smile creeping across his face. "Well, I'll be back. Just wanted to say thank you." As he turned to leave, Sarah watched him go, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over her. He hadn't just come back for the meal or the coffee. He had come back because he felt seen. He had come back because, for once, someone had treated him like a person, not a problem. It was then that Sarah realized how much she had changed too. She hadn't just learned to see Joe. She had learned to see herself, to treat herself with the same compassion that she now extended to others, to acknowledge her own worth, her own struggles, and her own need for connection. The diner wasn't just a place where food was served. It was a place where people came to be seen, to be heard, to be understood. Sarah felt grateful to be a part of it. And as for the world outside, maybe it was still a little broken. Maybe it would always be. But Sarah had learned something important, that kindness, no matter how small, could heal a part of it. And it was that small act of kindness, multiplied by countless others, that could change the world one person at a time. What about you? Have you ever had an experience where one small act of kindness completely changed your outlook? How do you think the world would be different if we all made an effort to truly see one another? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. And if you haven't yet, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us of the power of compassion. Together, we can create more ripples of kindness in the world. The week had passed in a blur, with Sarah trying to keep up with her usual duties while also being mindful of the new approach she was taking toward her customers. She was finding that a little effort went a long way, and the connections she made, small as they might seem, felt more meaningful than anything she'd experienced before. But even with all these subtle changes, there was one thing that still gnawed at her. Joe had been absent since that day he came in with the groceries. He hadn't returned, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfinished. It was one quiet Tuesday afternoon when she finally saw him again. The usual hum of the diner was replaced by a peaceful stillness as the lunch rush had passed. Sarah was wiping down a table near the window when she saw a familiar face outside. There, standing hesitantly on the sidewalk, was Joe. His eyes were scanning the diner as if he were debating whether or not to come in. Something inside Sarah stirred. She had to act on it. Without thinking, she walked toward the door, swung it open, and stepped outside. "Joe," she called, her voice catching his attention. "It's good to see you. Come on in." He looked over at her, uncertainty still in his expression, but there was a faint trace of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I didn't know if you'd still be okay with me coming back," he admitted, scratching the back of his head. Of course I'm okay with it, Sarah said, her tone warm. You're always welcome here. Joe took a step forward, his gaze lingering on Sarah. I wanted to come back for a while, but I don't know. I wasn't sure if I really belonged here. Everyone belongs here, Sarah said, smiling. You've got a seat at this table any time. We're all just trying to make it through this crazy world, right? Joe nodded, his eyes softening. Yeah, I guess we are. He paused for a moment before adding, You've made a difference, Sarah. You and Keanu both. I didn't forget that. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't expected him to say something like that, especially after everything he'd been through. I'm glad you came back. I've been thinking about you. I've been thinking about you too, Joe replied. And about the other people here. It's not just you, it's everyone. I don't know how to explain it, but things feel different. People are kinder. They smile more. Even when they don't know your name, they see you. It's like you're not invisible anymore. A wave of emotion hit Sarah, and she fought to keep herself composed. She never realized how much her small acts of kindness had impacted Joe, let alone the others in the diner. It wasn't just about giving him a meal or offering him a place to sit. It was about making him feel human again, worthy of respect and care. I'm so glad, Sarah said, her voice quiet but sincere. That was always the goal, to make everyone feel like they matter. Joe gave her a small nod. Well, mission accomplished. I feel like I matter again, and that's something I didn't know I needed until you showed me. Sarah smiled, touched by his words. You've always mattered, Joe. You just needed to see. It too. They both stood there for a moment, the weight of their words hanging in the air between them. It wasn't just about Joe anymore. It was about Sarah, too. She had grown in ways she hadn't expected. Her view of the world, her view of people, had completely shifted. And it wasn't just one person who had made that change possible. It was a collective effort. It was the kindness that had rippled from Joe to her and from her to others. With a deep breath, Sarah gestured back to the diner. Come on, let's get you something to eat. The usual. Joe grinned, the same boyish smile Sarah had seen on him that first day. Yeah, the usual sounds good. As they entered the diner together, Sarah felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. For the first time, she could see how much the diner had become a reflection of its people. The kindness, the compassion, the understanding. It wasn't just happening between Sarah and Joe anymore. It was happening everywhere. They sat down at Joe's favorite booth, and Sarah went to grab his coffee. As she poured it, she glanced over at the other customers in the diner. She saw Clara chatting with a couple who had just walked in, laughing as they exchanged stories. Sarah noticed a regular customer, an older man, nodding politely at the young woman who had just come in for a quick bite. He hadn't always been that friendly before. The changes were subtle, but they were real. The energy in the diner had shifted. It was more alive, more connected. And Sarah knew this was only the beginning. As she returned to the table, she placed the coffee in front of Joe. Here you go. One fresh cup, on the house. Joe's eyes sparkled, a genuine smile crossing his face. Thanks, Sarah. You really don't know how much this means to me. She shook her head with a laugh. I think I do now. As Sarah sat down across from Joe, she realized that in making a difference in his life, she had unknowingly transformed her own as well. And now here they were, both in a place where they could start anew, together in this small diner surrounded by the simple acts of kindness that could heal the wounds of the past. The world may have been full of challenges, but Sarah knew that with each kind word, each small gesture, they were all one step closer to making it a better place for everyone. What do you think? Have you ever witnessed or been a part of a change as profound as this one? How do you think small gestures of kindness can impact a community? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you want to hear more stories about how a little love and compassion can truly change lives. Let's keep the ripple effect going. It was a Friday afternoon, the kind where the sun was low enough in the sky to cast a golden hue over everything. Sarah stood behind the counter of the diner, her arms folded as she watched the steady flow of customers. The place was bustling, filled with the usual crowd, some regulars, a few new faces, and even a couple of local business owners stopping by for a quick meal. But something was different today. There was a warmth in the air that hadn't been there before. A sense of community, a sense of belonging. Sarah could feel it in the way the conversations flowed freely between tables, the laughter that echoed through the diner, and the way people interacted with each other. It wasn't just about eating anymore. It was about connection. There was something magical in the air, something that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, small acts of kindness really could change the world. As she poured a cup of coffee for a customer, she caught sight of Joe sitting by the window, quietly observing the busy scene. He had come back to the diner every day since that afternoon when he'd returned with groceries. He wasn't just a guest anymore. Joe had become a part of the diner's heartbeat. He came in not only for a meal, but to check on Sarah, to chat with the regulars, and to help when the rush was heavy. It had become his way of giving back to the place that had helped him find his footing again. As Sarah made her way over to Joe's booth, she saw him looking out the window, his fingers wrapped around his coffee cup. She sat down across from him, her heart full as she noticed the contentment in his face. "You're looking a lot more at peace these days," Sarah said with a smile, sitting down across from him. Joe nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the view outside. "I feel it. It's not just about being back here, Sarah. It's about how different everything feels. I never thought I'd find peace, you know, not after everything I've been through. But here, I feel like I've got a place, a reason to keep going." Sarah's chest tightened at his words, and she found herself struggling to find the right thing to say. But then Joe spoke again, his voice quieter this time, as if he were sharing something deeply personal. "I never thought anyone would care about me again. It's like I was invisible, like I didn't matter. But you and everyone here have shown me that I'm not alone, that I still have something to give." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat, but she quickly swallowed it. Down. She reached across the table and placed her hand on his. "You're not alone, Joe, and you matter more than you know. You've made a difference here. In my life. In everyone's life." Joe met her gaze, and for a moment, they both sat there in silence, the weight of their shared understanding hanging between them. It was a moment of quiet gratitude, a recognition of how far they both had come since their paths had first crossed. A sudden burst of laughter from a nearby table broke the silence, and both Sarah and Joe turned to see a group of young people celebrating a birthday. They raised their glasses, and Sarah couldn't help but smile. Life was full of little moments like this, moments that made everything worth it, moments that reminded her that even in the chaos, there was beauty. "You know," Joe said, breaking Sarah's train of thought, "I was thinking about something today." "What's that?" Sarah asked, intrigued. "I was thinking about how much this place has changed me. I mean, when I first walked in here, I was broken. I felt like I had nothing left to give. But every day I've come back, I've realized that there's always more to give. And it doesn't have to be big stuff. Sometimes it's just being there, listening, sharing a meal, helping out." Sarah smiled softly, her heart swelling with pride. "That's exactly it, Joe. Small things, small acts of kindness. Kindness that doesn't ask for anything in return. That's how change happens, not in one big moment, but in 1,000 little ones." Joe nodded, his eyes gleaming with a quiet realization. "Yeah, and it spreads, doesn't it? Like a ripple in the water. You do one kind thing for someone, and maybe they'll do something kind for someone else. And before you know it, it's everywhere." "That's the idea," Sarah agreed, her voice thick with emotion. "That's the hope." At that moment, Clara came over to their booth, a smile on her face. "Hey, you two. Just wanted to let you know that the owner from the local bookstore stopped by and wanted to talk to you, Sarah. Seems like they've heard about all the changes here and are really interested in teaming up for a charity event." Sarah blinked, surprised. "A charity event? What do you mean?" Clara shrugged. "I'm not sure, but it sounds like they want to do something for the community. They're planning to bring in a few local businesses and organize some kind of fundraiser. They think it could really help raise awareness about homelessness and how to support people in need." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. This was more than she had ever expected. She had started this journey with a simple goal: to make people feel seen, to offer kindness where it was lacking. But now, It was turning into something bigger, something that could reach beyond the diner. "That sounds incredible," Sarah said, looking at Joe, who nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah," he said, his voice full of hope. "It's exactly what this world needs." As Clara walked away, Sarah leaned back in her seat, a sense of accomplishment and fulfillment washing over her. She had done more than just offer a hot meal or a friendly smile. She had sparked a movement that was bigger than herself, bigger than the diner, bigger than any one person. It was a movement of kindness, of seeing each other, of understanding that every person, no matter their past, deserves to be treated with dignity. As she looked around the diner, Sarah realized that this was just the beginning. She had started. A ripple, and now it was spreading, one person, one act of kindness at a time. What do you think? Have you ever experienced the ripple effect of kindness in your own life? How have small gestures of goodwill made an impact on your community or the people around you? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to read more stories of hope, change, and the power of compassion. Together, we can keep the ripple going.